There's a lot of space in the front, so I would encourage those of you who want to be closer to this side, do come forward. Don't be shy. Give me the cue, Yvonne, when it's 10:15. No. Okay. Good morning, friends. Welcome to the side event of the Third World Network, together with the government of Bolivia. It's a pleasure to meet you on the first day of the talks, which is also the World Environment Day. And the theme this year is Say No to Plastics. And of course, all the plastics are incredibly related to climate change as well. So we just have to remember today as a very significant day and the start of the talks. It's regretful that the head of delegation of Bolivia is not able to join us this morning, Senior Dr. Diego Pacheco. He's right now involved in a consultation with heads of delegations, which is happening in some room somewhere in the conference center. And in case you don't know what they are consulting about, and if you're wondering why the opening of the subsidiary bodies has not happened as yet, it's because there is a discussion going on whether to include the mitigation work program on the agenda of the subsidiary body on implementation. I'll talk more about that later at the end if you're interested. Why are they still fighting over an agenda on mitigation? The mitigation is one of the most toxic of all, toxic in the sense of political hot potato in these talks. Welcome to Mr. Vincente Paulo Yu III. He loves being that entire title. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our speakers. My name is Meena Raman from the Third World Network. Been here for so many COPs and so many subsidiary body meetings. So very happy to be here. The Third World Network puts out a daily update on what the talks are about. So in case you're wondering what's going on, please go to our website. If you go to the daily program, there is also a link will take you to the Third World Network website, which gives you a snapshot of all the issues, the key issues that are happening here, and so that you are able to navigate what is going on. So gives me great pleasure to invite Dr. Tejal Kanitkar from, she happens to be from India, but she's actually an engineer by profession. I keep saying social scientist, and she reminds me that she's actually an engineer. And Tejal has done some very interesting and amazing work on an equity assessment of the IPCC scenarios. Now, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is the scientific body which is seen as the arena where everybody goes to be informed about what science tells us. And interestingly, Tejal has looked at the IPCC scenarios, and she has done an equity assessment, because whenever we talk about ambition in this conference, we always say that ambition can only go together with equity. Given the nature of what the whole context of emissions have been, from historical emissions and looking at the cumulative emissions from pre-industrial era, and looking at how the world has to go forward in a fair and also equitable way forward. So without further delay, let me invite Tejal to do her presentation.
Thank you very much, Meena. It's always a pleasure to speak at Third World Network events, be amongst friends and like-minded colleagues. As Meena said, the IPCC and the results of the IPCC, three working groups, their various reports, form what we consider to be authoritative scientific input to policy making. The IPCC is supposed to produce policy-relevant science, or supposed to assess it. The IPCC doesn't produce the science; it assesses the science, and it's supposed to give us the most recent or best available, the cutting edge of science, and tell us what we are, where we are, and where we are likely to be, and where we would want to be. So, do the IPCC scenarios, and the scenarios. There's a lot of discussion and debate about whether the IPCC construct these scenarios, whether the IPCC only assesses scenarios. There is a lot of gray area there, but I won't go into into those technical details right now. However, the IPCC is very much embedded in the scenarios that they assess. If you see the scenarios that are assessed in the IPCC, you look at who has produced these. A large bulk, over 90% of the scenarios, come from developed countries, models based in developed countries. And these are also assessed largely by the same set of people. So you don't have a separation. Typically, in peer review, we don't review our own papers. That's not done, right? But here, however, if you look at who assesses the scenarios and who produces the scenarios, there is a great overlap. And so therefore, it's unfortunate that the IPCC itself doesn't do an equity assessment. It is left up to those of us who are interested in questions of equity and justice to do an assessment of what these scenarios do and how they fare on questions of equity and justice. And that's why, the title of what I'm going to say, I've kept it as The Future We Want, a critical evaluation of these scenarios. Do the IPCC scenarios project a future that we would want? And the we here is very much a we, as in the Global South. Is this the future that the Global South would look forward to, even if it is a 1.5 degrees Celsius future? And this is based on two papers, one that a preprint of which we released just before before COP27, and another paper by a set of colleagues on which we've also put together a policy brief, which we'll release soon. Which a preprint of which has been released just very recently, that focuses on questions of carbon dioxide removal and food security. I will present results from both of these. But just again, a little bit more in terms of context of scenarios. Everybody in this room, I'm sure, is aware of the 43% reduction from 2010 levels in the Glasgow Pact. That number, 43%, comes from scenarios, right? And this is a lot of what the IPCC outreach focuses on is scenario-based. These are models, and they are largely integrated assessment models. They are a mixture of economic models. So you have partial general equilibrium models, typically, that are used by economists to make future projections. They're a mixture of that with energy sector models, looking at least cost optimization for the future. These are optimization models that project what is the best possible, and the best here is what is the least cost. How is it that we can achieve a 1.5 degrees Celsius world in the most efficient way? And so these numbers come from these kinds of modeling exercises. And now, because 1.5 has become so difficult, given the lack of action by developed countries historically, even since acknowledging that they must take the lead since 1992, there has been highly inadequate action on this front. A large proportion of the global carbon budget has already been exhausted. 4/5 of the carbon budget for a 1.5 degrees Celsius, even a 50% probability of 1.5 degrees Celsius is exhausted. 2/3 for a 2 degrees Celsius budget is exhausted. And so this has meant that even with large deployment of renewable energy, etc., the models themselves, forget the real world, even simulated models cannot deliver 1.5 degrees Celsius worlds without a large land component that needs to be added. So you have a CDR, a carbon dioxide removal, and land dynamics component. So these are vegetation models that have now been added to these integrated assessment models. And you have, Earth system feedbacks, etc., that they look at. So the IPCC depends heavily on these results. The Working Group 3, which looks at mitigation of and emission scenarios, especially so. They put out a call for scenarios, and then people are supposed to submit the scenarios. Again, there is a lot of debate about how easy it is to submit scenarios and who submits these scenarios. But even of the scenarios submitted, the IPCC, especially the numbers that you see of 95% coal reduction, 60% oil reduction, etc., 43% reduction in emissions, or 45% in GHGs, those numbers come from these global models. They don't come from national level models, they come from global models. So out of the 2,425 scenarios that were submitted for the 6th assessment report, only 1,202, so half of the scenarios were chopped off. The authors selected only a subset, which is 1,202 scenarios, which fit the vetting criteria that they set. Again, there are questions of who sets the vetting criteria. If you have the same people who produce the models setting the vetting criteria and then assessing the models, there is a serious conflict of interest here in terms of what then gets assessed in the models. So 700 of these 1,202 scenarios that come from around 21 models are compatible with the 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius temperature goals of the Paris Agreement. These are what you see in the summary for policymakers is a global assessment, global results. However, these global results are arrived at by looking at regional assumptions. There are regional classifications that underlie this. So there's an optimization that is done across regions. Right? And so around 556 of these have an underlying 10-region classification. The remaining have a classification that is continent-wise. So it's 6 regions or 5 regions. It doesn't allow for an equity assessment of equity because you can't separate out the dominant economies in each region, for example, overshadow some of the results. So we've looked at these 556 and outcomes across GDP, consumption of goods and services, primary energy consumption, fossil fuel consumption, CO2 sequestration, etc. A smaller subset, 354 of these scenarios have an integrated land use component, which allows for an assessment of food security outcomes. So we look at food demand, food price, and this is some of our colleagues, Dr. Shrija Jaiswal, Dr. Arvindan Nagarajan, and Akhil Maitri. They have a preprint out, and they have done an analysis of food demand, food price, population at the risk of hunger, and land use for energy crops and afforestation in these scenarios, and what kind of projections do these scenarios make. So the results are very, very stark. And before, when we accepted those numbers of 43%, et cetera, at Glasgow, the database of these scenarios was not made public. Working Group 3, if you remember, Working Group 3 report was not yet released. During Glasgow, it was only the first Working Group 1, that had released its report. So a lot of these discussions were not yet had. However, in last August, 2022 August, they released July, they released the database of these scenarios, and we could do this equity assessment. And it is very clear that the world that is projected for 2050, 2100, in the near term, medium term, or long term, is a highly unequal world with enduring levels of poverty across a major part of the global south. This world is achieved by the suppression of incomes and development and growth in the developing regions. If you look at the per capita GDP in C1 scenarios now, these are basically the 1.5 degrees Celsius scenarios with no or limited overshoot. The temperature doesn't overshoot 1.5. There is a very small, around 97 scenarios that fit this. So you have, these are the GDP projections. The red arrows show the Annex 1, broadly the Annex 1 regions. The blue arrows show broadly the non-Annex 1 regions. So if you see, with the exception of the China plus region in the models, where the GDP grows slightly more simply because they're on a high GDP growth trajectory already, the rest of the developing world is restricted to very low levels of GDP. Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia bear the brunt of the suppression of incomes and development. These are average numbers across scenarios. So there would be countries within these regions that do even worse in terms of GDP growth. If you look at consumption of goods and services, this is another variable that is used. It's a component of the GDP. It's used in the models. It's suppressed even further. And the difference between the developed and the developing countries on these variables is extremely stark. If you look at sub-Saharan Africa, it goes from a level of $1,000 per person in 2020 to around $3,000 per person in 2050. The projections are for 2050. Whereas if you look at North America, they go from 35,000 per person to 59,000 per person. So the differences between the projections for the global south and the global north are extremely stark. Even when you know this theoretically, and there is literature that speaks about this, that predates some of the IPCC reports. When you know this theoretically, actually looking at the numbers tells you how stark the level of inequalities that are projected for the future actually are. And this is not just the projection of inequality. This is actually the projection of enduring poverty and deprivation in the developing world for the foreseeable future. There is, of course, this is per capita consumption. This is linked very closely to a restriction on primary energy use. And this is not only fossil fuel use. One can even understand if fossil fuel consumption is restricted across all regions. But this is not fossil fuel. This is primary energy consumption, which is restricted far more severely for the developing countries, for the global south. If you look at the last two bars on the end, that's South Asia and sub-Saharan Africa. This is 30% of the world. This is where 30% of the population of the world lives. And we are talking about a severe restriction on energy consumption in this part of the world. This is, of course, allows for higher fossil fuel consumption, continued higher per capita fossil fuel consumption in the global north, even as late as 2050. You have 1.5 degrees Celsius scenarios that allow for an increase in gas use. If you actually, even the summary for policymakers of the Working Group 3 report, if you look at beyond that one number that is quoted, in the brackets there are ranges that are quoted. And you'll see for natural gas, the range begins from a negative value. That negative value means that you're projecting an increase in gas use in the future. And this is, of course, in the global north, right? It doesn't happen in the global south. So you have, and this is, if you have, an inequality projected for 1.5, what happens with the 2 degrees Celsius scenarios? 2 degrees Celsius gives more room, more carbon budget, but that more room is taken up by the global north. It's not as if the global south gets more flexibility if you actually overshoot 1.5. You don't, because that whatever extra room you get is taken up by developed countries. And you are allowed, developed countries are allowed even higher per capita fossil fuel use in the 2 degrees Celsius scenarios. And this, how is this possible? This is compensated by a very high level of carbon dioxide removal in the developing regions. So you have the difference between the two variables that are used and that we have access to are carbon dioxide removal through afforestation, land use, and carbon dioxide removal through CCS. Right? And both of these are very high in the non-Annex 1 regions. If you look at the blue graphs, for example, that is carbon dioxide removal in the non-Annex 1 regions. The red graphs are in the Annex 1 regions, except for the C3 scenarios where there's some parity. But even there, land use-based removals are much, much lesser in the developed countries. They're much higher in the developing countries. So higher fossil fuel consumption in rich countries and should be compensated by land-based removals in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, the rest of Asia, and Latin America. Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa reach net zero much, much before most other regions in most of these models. In some of the scenarios, North America and Europe are allowed to reach net zero even beyond 2050. right? Compensated by higher and much faster land-based removals in developing countries much earlier. And this holds across, this is a constant across all models. It's not as if it's one or two models that do this. Across all models, you get similar results. So it doesn't matter that you have 21 models if all 21 models give you the same results. They're the same models, they're the same structure, they have the same assumptions, more or less, with minor differences here and there. They either assume inequality to be endogenously produced in the models, or they fix inequality exogenously and then input it into the models. So it's not, that's a mainstay in many ways. Over 60 to 80% of the carbon dioxide removal that is assumed, and that's quite high. If you look at the total amounts of carbon dioxide removal that are assumed in these models, they're almost equivalent to the total remaining carbon budget, right? And sometimes even more across some of those models. This has severe implications for food security. Increasingly stringent mitigation in the scenarios radically reverses the current trends of reduced hunger. So this is a very, very stark result, and there is literature that acknowledges this. It's also there in the full IPCC report. It, however, gets very weak mention in the summary for policymakers. It's in fact almost glossed over in terms of how stark this is. Across the scenarios, there is increased risk of hunger. Today, we actually have a trend where the risk of hunger is reducing. Food insecurity is reducing. There's an overall long-term global trend. But these trends are reversed under these mitigation scenarios, partly due to the land-based removals. I mean, largely due to land-based removals, but through a multitude of different assumptions. You have a huge focus on energy crops. If you have a large number of energy crops, you have competition for land, which increases food prices. And so you have a suppression of food demand in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, and some other regions as well, resulting from the assumptions in the scenarios. And then there are papers that talk about how this should be managed. This can be managed outside through food aid, so increased dependence of developing countries on developed countries, or through agricultural subsidies, measures which are opposed by developed countries in other forums, in non-climate forums as well. So these are, some of the, I am out of time, so I'm going to sort of wrap up here. The summary is, of course, that we have these scenarios projecting a highly unequal world for the future. They are pervasive, these inequalities, across all variables. This is not just about who gets to use more fossil fuel or less fossil fuel. It's about who gets to develop and who gets to become richer and who has to remain poor. The cost of achieving high levels of mitigation is assumed to be enduring poverty in a large part of the developing world. And like I said, this future that is imagined in the scenarios is coming from a large number of models that are developed in the global north. Right? When you say this to the modelers, they say, oh, but scenarios can be developed by anybody. We can make some of this open source. But who designs the architecture? Because only part of the problem comes from the assumptions made in the scenarios. The other part of the problem is the structure of the models themselves. They explicitly disallow an equalization of incomes. You have ways in which they make assumptions. The structure of the model disallows any kind of transfers of finance or any kind of equalization of incomes across regions. Because if they do this, the problem of underdevelopment overwhelms the problem of climate change. And this is something that is acknowledged by the modelers themselves in various papers. Right? So, like I said, some of this is attributable to the assumptions. Who builds the scenarios? So what kinds of assumptions do they make? It's cost minimization. So if it's cheaper to achieve mitigation through keeping a large part of the world poor, as compared to reducing oil and gas use in the richer countries, that's what we'll do, right? And there is no discussion about whether this is acceptable. This is an acceptable future or not at all. So there is no distributive justice. There's no possibility of distributive justice in these models and their assumptions. And so there is a weak disclaimer in the IPCC summary for policymakers and the full report that there are no explicit assumptions of equity and CBDRRC. They don't use CBDRRC, but no explicit assumptions of global equity or income distributions in the models. But I say that this is a weak disclaimer because there's actually they're contravening the principles of equity and CBDRRC. It's not just there is no explicit assumption, but you're perpetuating inequality through these scenarios. You're assuming that the only way in which we are going to achieve this is through continued inequality in the future. You have higher short-term reductions, even short-term. Near-term reductions are higher in sub-Saharan Africa and China, for example, in some of the scenarios as compared to North America and Europe, right? There are non-transparent assumptions that underlie some of these aggregate global targets that are currently sought to be imposed in this policy making. You have global emissions reductions that I've already referred to, 43% reduction, mid-century net zero years, peaking years. All of these are coming from these scenarios. There is no one scenario, and there are footnotes in the IPCC that says that these scenarios are not sacrosanct. You don't have to accept them as they are. There are multiple different scenarios that can give you similar outcomes. However, they are taken by the media and then also by climate policy community over here as being sacrosanct, and you take this one number out of context without looking at what kind of assumptions underlie these numbers. And so their inclusion, especially immediately in the context of the GST, the global stocktake, but also in the context of COP decisions in general, I think is untenable, simply because there is no equity and, there is neither the best available science, because what is this best available science that says food security has to increase for us to achieve the kind of mitigation outcomes that we want? Because it's too difficult or impractical for the developed world to reduce emissions. But it is not impractical, and it is possible for the developing world to become more food insecure. I mean, this kind of a projection is unacceptable. So it's, I think, violates both what I would call the best available science, and it also does violate equity. There's no doubt about that. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tejal. I mean, that's absolutely alarming. When I heard this at the COP last year, I nearly fell off my chair, because we all quote IPCC as the best available science, and we put them into the decisions, and then we talk about equity as if it doesn't matter, and this is climate injustice in the highest order. So this is why we have Tejal, and whatever Tejal has said, these briefing papers are on the TWN website. You can Google them and you can find them, and thank God you have done these analyses. Otherwise, we are all absorbing them as if they are the gospel truth coming from the Holy Grail. So I think we really need to interrogate this. This provides a nice segue to Mr. Vicente Paulo III, who everybody knows as Vice, and he is a consultant to the Third World Network, and he's also the G77 focal point or coordinator for what? You explain.
Thank you, Meena, and thank you, Tejal, for that excellent presentation. I think I'm right now coordinating the G77 for global stocktake and for loss and damage. I've been doing global stocktake since before the global stocktake existed. So I've been working with a group on the periodic review all the way before Doha, and then negotiated Article 14, and then negotiated the modalities for the global stocktake. And then on loss and damage, I've been working with the group in terms of helping them on that since Madrid in 2019. I was asked to sort of like give you folks an overview of what we expect at these SB sessions on both the GST and the loss and damage. But I can't help but also react to what Teja was saying, because I think what she has put forward is, in fact, I think, at the core of what the G77 had been raising in the context of the GST from the very beginning, which is that equity is a key basis for how we undertake the collective assessment of progress that we're supposed to do in the GST. That is the reason why there is in both Article 14 of the Paris Agreement and in the modalities for the GST, there is a reference to equity. That was because we had always been concerned about the assumptions. They are not implicit, but they are actually written out assumptions in many of these models. If you read Chapter 6 of Working Group 3, which is about the assumptions underlying the IAMs, they in fact write it out. It's just that many of the journalists don't actually read Chapter 6. But if you read that, if you look at the underlying assumptions that they have listed out there, it actually says what Tejal has been pointing out, which is that many of these assumptions imply a great deal of inequality going forward. It implies a lot of assumptions about technology, the availability of technology, and what kind of technology are needed for these mitigation scenarios, including among them, as Tejal was pointing out, what they call this technology called BECS, bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, which in fact is about, for example, planting industrial plantations and then cutting them down, which then has implications on land and agriculture and all that. So many of these assumptions are in fact do not really reflect equity in the essential concept of the word, which is about making things fair for in a world that is highly unequal. And so that is a key G77 talking point in terms of what we are expecting out of the global stocktake coming out from here. So on the global stocktake, at this SB session, there will be several things that will be happening, right? Moving parts. One is what we call the technical dialogue, which is supposed to be this technical assessment component of the global stocktake, where we take in information inputs, we hear from the experts, parties and non-party stakeholders, interrogate and work with the experts to actually identify many of these things. And this is about the themes of the global stocktake. So mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, response measures, the means of implementation. We have been concerned, and we have been raising this as G77, about the fact that equity seems to be not very well reflected so far in how the technical dialogue has been moving, and in terms of where the written output of the technical dialogue so far have been showing equity. And that is largely because I think for many reasons, many of the inputs that have gone into the technical dialogue have been on mitigation, have been on and much less on the equity aspects of it. Definitely not so much in terms of interrogating the assumptions in the IPCC, for example. So that is an issue that we need to address. At the technical dialogue, we are therefore looking for what would be the findings that will be coming out, which the co-facilitators would be generating through the process that we expect to be undertaken here, including the World Cafes and the roundtables. But in parallel to the work of the technical dialogue, what we expect also is that we will be starting the political work. COP28 is only a few months away. We, as those of us who are negotiators, we're negotiating as parties, still haven't gotten around to identifying what is the outline for this decision that we're supposed to take on the global stocktake. It's supposed to be the one of the, if not the, key political output for COP28 because it is mandated. We don't have an idea yet of what will be the topics we would be covering in that decision. How will we approach those topics? What is the outline, if you will, of that decision? And so we hope, at least at these joint contact group sessions here in Bonn, we will start that process. work on it between now and COP28, so that at COP28 we'll have a clear idea of what that GST decision would look like that we would have to adopt. In Katowice in 2018, we did agree on certain parameters for what that decision should contain. It should contain opportunities, identify challenges, identify opportunities, identify good practices. It should identify key political messages. But what these are, we don't know. We are going to depend on the technical dialogue to tell us what those findings are. And then the joint contact group would then negotiate how we understand those findings and put them into a key political message or messages. And there, I think the parameters for that are going to be very much most likely shaped by what is also happening outside of the global stocktake. Like, for example, this push to have a discussion on a mitigation-oriented agenda item. This push to the discussions around the global goal on adaptation, the discussions on the NCQG that Andres will be talking about later on finance and all of those things. So they will all have a role to play in terms of what are the political messages that we would have to agree on in Dubai coming out from the global stocktake. Because at the end of the day, the global stocktake is supposed to inform governments next year as they start writing out their NDCs. What that information will be at this point in time in terms of what the political messaging of those information will be, we do not know yet because we still have to negotiate that. So that's for the global stocktake. For the loss and damage part of the discussions that we'll be having here in Bonn, there are three main parts to that discussion. One is, and I think we have to contextualize this also in terms of where we have progressed with respect to loss and damage in the multilateral climate regime, right? So if you look historically, loss and damage was first raised 30 years ago. First started raising its head as part of, as an issue in the climate process around the mid-2000s. We got the first institutional part of it in 2013 when we created the WIM, the World Warsaw Implementation Mechanism. It took us 7 years to get the next step, which is to create a body that would focus on providing technical assistance on loss and damage on the ground. And that came in the form of the Santiago Network that we established in Madrid in 2019, which is on technical assistance and other support. Between 2013 and 2019, the G77 had been raising loss and damage finance as a political issue, but there were always no takers from the other side. So we raised it again in 2019, got shut down there, pandemic happened, raised it again in 2021 in Glasgow on loss and damage finance, even as we were working on negotiating the institutional arrangements for the Santiago Network to be operational. 2021, Glasgow came, loss and damage funding, put forward a proposal, got shut down by the developed countries. They absolutely did not want to talk about it. They offered us the Glasgow Dialogue instead as a talk shop. Of course, we were not happy with it. Last year, we put in, again, that push, massive effort with support from civil society, and from the research community, and we got establishment of the Loss and Damage Fund and the other funding arrangements. So now we are at this juncture in 2023, where we are at that step of finally operationalizing the Santiago Network for technical assistance by selecting a host agency and for constituting the advisory board for that Santiago Network, so that hopefully by next year it will start operating, secretariat is set up, and developing countries can then go and start asking for technical assistance and other support. this year is also the time when we are supposed to hear from the Transitional Committee on what would be the design of the Loss and Damage Fund and the other funding arrangements and how they work together. So we're waiting for that, but in the meantime, here at this session in Bonn, we will have the Glasgow Dialogue to talk about, as parties, to talk about those issues which should inform the Transitional Committee on that. So hopefully by the end of this year, we would then have a more fully fleshed out institutional architecture for loss and damage. So if you will, it has taken at least a decade to put loss and damage as an institutional pillar together with mitigation, adaptation, and transparency, and the means of implementation. So it takes that long because of a lot of these processes taking so long. But hopefully, if things go well, we should be able to take another step towards that, so that hopefully by next year, we would have the Santiago network up and running. We would have a clear idea of how the loss and damage fund will be up and running. And then the challenge then after that will be implementation. In the same way that we continue to face challenges with respect to implementation and adaptation, challenges with respect to implementation and finance, and technology transfer and capacity building, as well as mitigation. So maybe let me end here, Mina. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, Vice. Two very big outcomes that are expected at COP28, building on where we go from here on the global stocktake, which will be the biggest media headline in terms of the decisions, because it's supposed to be an assessment of what we have not done over the years. And many people who come to this process ask us, it takes so long? And even if it takes so long, the issue is whether it will be just and fair and equitable. I think that's really the overarching. And the other, of course, the loss and damage, particularly the loss and damage fund. Two things we'll be watching, and we wish you good luck on the G77 to be totally united, because it's only when the G77 is united can you get any real outcome. So we will watch that very closely and really wish you really a lot of good luck. And whenever you need us, do let us know. We will make a lot of noise for you. Next, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Andres Mogro. He's Ecuadorian by nationality. He's now working with the Avina Foundation. He's really a climate finance expert. And he did negotiate as a G77 coordinator last year on finance issues, the biggest problem in this process. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Mina, and thank you everyone for joining us at this event. It's certainly very difficult to go after Tijal and Vice's interventions on those very critical issues, but I'll give it my best to give you an overview of what's happening on the finance side of things, which certainly, as Vice told you, things in the climate world tend to move much slower than we wish they would. And on the climate finance side, we've been moving backwards. We've been moving the wrong way, and I want to tell you why. So I want to begin again by thanking TWN for their invitation to participate in this event and for the daily updates that they put out every day. They're certainly very useful for everyone following the negotiations. As Mina told you, I've been participating in this world for a few years now. I've been coordinating the G77 on finance and on different issues for the last 9 years, from COP20 to COP27. And I want to begin by saying that there are three things that any multilateral climate agreement needs to be successful, and we haven't achieved those three with either. And whenever I do this comparison, I tend to do a dumb example, and I apologize for that, but what I say is having a successful climate agreement is kind of when you're looking for a boyfriend or a girlfriend, a spouse. You need three things for that to happen. You need somebody who wants to be with you or be single, somebody who you find attractive, and somebody who's not crazy. and you usually tend to find 2 out of 3. So they're either single and not crazy, but you don't find them attractive, or they're single and attractive, but they're crazy, or they're sound of mind and attractive, but they're not single. And with the climate agreements, that has happened. We need 3 things for that to work. We need universal participation, we need ambition, and we need enforceability. And it so happens when I look at what we've done throughout the process, we have the UNFCCC, which has universal participation and ambition, because if you look at the commitments in the UNFCCC from nearly 30 years ago, they're more ambitious than any NDC, than anything that the Paris Agreement says, but it didn't have enforceability. That's why we spent 20 years trying to get things to be fulfilled. I mean, we had very clear commitments there. We have everything in Article 4.5 says what everyone has to do. And then you know where support is supposed to be coming from, where finance is supposed to be coming from. That's Article 4.3, 4.5, 4.7. It was very clear, but didn't have enforceability. So it was lacking that thing. And then we had the Kyoto Protocol, and the Kyoto Protocol had ambition because it had top-down commitments instead of what we have in the Paris Agreement now. And it had enforceability, but never had universal participation. Because the US never came in the second commitment period. And this is a story that I'm not sure if I should tell you, but we were lied to in Durban in 2011 when we were told that there would be a second commitment period and not to worry as long as we agreed to develop something new. And then next year, everyone left the Kyoto Protocol. So we had a second commitment period, but it was a European commitment period based on the baseline of the EU. So it was a lie what we had in 2011. But so the Kyoto Protocol never had universal participation. It was ambitious and it was enforceable, but there it was. And it so happens that just the slot that we needed for something universal participation, enforceable with no ambition, is what the Paris Agreement came to do. Because what the Paris Agreement says is basically everyone is participating. It was a very big political push for everyone to ratify this in 2015 as fast as we can. But what the Paris Agreement says is we all have commitments, and our commitments is to decide what our commitments are, and then we'll report on that. So it's almost like telling me you have to run a marathon and you will get a medal if you achieve your marathon, but you decide how long you want to run. And I would say I'm going to run 100 meters, and then purposefully I'll run 110, so I overachieve, and I'll be the good guy. But that's what's happening with the Paris Agreement, and it's even more difficult when the enabling conditions for that to happen in the developing world, which is finance, is nowhere to be seen in any NDC whatsoever, despite what Article 3 of the Paris Agreement says. It says NDCs include mitigation, adaptation, finance, technology, capacity building. So those are 5 things that we agreed to in COP13, 17 years ago in Bali, that we had to do. I mean, whenever we implement climate action, we have to take into account 5 pillars. None of those can move alone. Mitigation, adaptation, technology, capacity building, and finance. And now things have moved the other way on the finance discussion, because now we speak about 3 pillars. We have ambition, we have support, which doesn't mean finance, and we have transparency. You'll see that throughout the negotiations we talk about ambition, support, and transparency. Ambition doesn't apply to adaptation, by the way. Ambition doesn't apply to finance. It doesn't apply to technology or capacity building. Ambition means more mitigation. Support doesn't mean finance. Support means capacity building. I'll give you an example as to what support means. You usually have, when you implement any climate action, you have 4 phases. You develop a baseline. In mitigation, for instance, you have to know what's happening. In adaptation, that's called a risk assessment or a vulnerability assessment, but you have to know what's happening within the place where you want to have an impact. Then you plan. You set up your goals now that you know what's happening. You implement your action, and you monitor. You have those 4 stages. Support means finance for stage 2 and stage 4. That's what's happened on finance. You have finance to set up your goals and then to monitor what you're doing. Nothing else. If you don't have data on the ground to know what you have to do, there is absolutely no finance to study or to have information about your realities. No finance for stage 1. You have finance for stage 2, which is like having finance to buy the rope and tie it around your neck. You don't have finance for stage 3 to implement anything. And once you set up your goals, you're on your own. And if you don't fulfill your goals, it's your fault. But you have a lot of finance to monitor and see how big of a failure you are. So that's what's happened in the finance world, more or less. I haven't looked at my notes. I wanted to. Which brings us back to what needs to happen in the negotiations. I think we need to bring back the reality that both Vice and Tejal were making reference to. Developing countries' actions are not necessarily something that we can demand of them without the recognition that they're enabling, and I hate the word enabling environments. You probably think of enabling and you think environments. Enabling environments means that you have to become sexy for finance, and if you don't and nobody wants to finance you, it's your fault. There have to be enabling conditions for that to happen. Enabling conditions mean you need finance for the 4 stages, basically. I mean, you can't have finance just for 1 or 2 or 2 and 4, which are purposefully thinking of a word that is a political synonym for evil, but English is not my first language. So they're purposefully disadvantageous for developing countries. And we need to correct that. There are a couple of spaces where COP28 can do that. One of them is the GST. There are giant expectations to what's going to happen in the GST. The process itself has become so large, and on the pro side of things, on the positive side of things, it has become very transparent and participative for non-state actors, non-governmental actors, civil society to be able to provide their inputs in. But on the other side of things, it has become so confusing sometimes, and expectations are so high that we don't really know what's going to happen at the COP. So in the COP, we know we'll have a political outcome around the GST. It needs to be some sort of declaration/decision, high-level thing, which usually never gets negotiated. We'll just see what happens. And there's also supposed to be a technical input from the GST that should influence somehow the next round, the next cycle of the Paris Agreement. Because if you look at the Paris Agreement, it's set up in cycles. And you have a cycle for NDCs that repeats every 5 years or every 10 years. You have a cycle for the GST that repeats every 5 years. You have a cycle for BTR that repeats every 2 years. So you have these tiny bubbles that need to connect to each other and inform each other. And the GST was always thought of as the space that informs the next round of NDCs. And if in the GST we're reaching a conclusion, which I think we should, around, for instance, what does it mean when most developing countries have presented their first round of NDCs and they have communicated a conditional and an unconditional component? You must have seen that happening in most NDCs in developing countries. That's because we responded to the fact that Article 3 says of the Paris Agreement that developed countries' NDCs need to talk about finance, technology, and capacity building. They don't. Neither of them do. They're just mitigation target. But we presented that with the expectation of informing the world what potential there is in our countries if enabling resources are met. And that was completely ignored. So I think one of the conclusions of the global stocktake is why has this happened? I mean, if that took an effort for most developing countries to do and to create scenarios and identify opportunities, but it was completely ignored by everyone. So that's the first thing. The second place where I think we need to have a conversation around in COP28 is around the operating entities of the financial mechanism of the convention. You have the GEF, the GCF, the Adaptation Fund, and eventually when it becomes operational, you have the LDF. I don't know how it will be called, but in the climate world, we love acronyms that end with F if it's on finance. So probably the LDF, but there is absolutely no link to any conversation around mobilizing resources and finance and needs of developing countries and how we get the finance to developing countries and all of these institutions that we've created throughout the years, which were supposed to be that channel. I mean, there's in the finance conversations, like the new collective quantified goal, the NCQG, the GST, all of those high-level finance conversations we're having. Everyone is responding in the technical expert dialogues or the breakout groups to the question of how we get finance to developing countries. We've been having that question 30 years ago. That's why we created institutions. The simple answer is through those institutions that have developed guidelines to do that. But apparently it's not so simple. Why? I don't know. But we've taken decisions, for instance, on the GCF saying a substantial amount of resources will be channeled through the GCF. And then you look at the reports coming from the Standing Committee on Finance last year on the biennial assessment of climate finance flows, for instance, and it says 80 billion have been mobilized to developing countries. And out of those 80 billion a year, probably less than one a year has been mobilized through the GCF. And I was saying in the negotiations at COP27, look, if I had 80 friends and one came to my birthday party, I'm not sure I would be able to say a substantial amount of my friends came to my birthday party, because that's not what's happening. But we don't have a conversation as to how those processes, the NCQG, the 100 billion goal, all of those high-level processes are connecting to replenishment of these entities. Because there are no replenishments of those entities. What you have is a specific amount of time in which those entities ask for donations of everyone. And those donations come with strings attached and conditions. And I'll donate if I like what you're saying in your board, or if I get a seat in your board in the Adaptation Fund, or those kinds of things. But that's not a link between commitments that have to come without strings attached to donations. And we're talking about donor countries now instead of providers and commitments that have been there. That's why I'm saying we've taken a step back and we're moving in the wrong direction in the finance world. And that with relation to the LDF, the Adaptation Fund, and GCF, and the replenishments. On the NCQG, am I doing good in time? on the NCQG, the new collective quantified goal. Agreeing on setting up a new goal should be a piece of good news, because we had the previous goal. We know that goal was not linked to needs of developing countries. It was not linked to science. It was a political thing. And this goal was adopted 15 years ago. It's 2009. And we've had it for 15 years. It hasn't been fulfilled. It probably won't be fulfilled. We know if you look at the details of the reporting of what's being provided as climate finance, you'll see that there was a report by Reuters that was just published at the beginning of the week. Developed countries are reporting things like making movies in the developing world as climate finance, because the movie has something to do with nature, so that's climate finance. Because we don't have a definition as to what isn't. So it's very difficult. It's very easy to move the numbers and get very close to the 100 billion. So agreeing to set up a new goal should be a conversation not just about the quantity on finance. We have information on the quantity. The SCF report on needs of developing countries speaks about 5 trillion. But it should be a conversation around the quality of finance, and we're not having that conversation anywhere. Developed countries are not willing to have that conversation anywhere. So quality meaning avoiding debt exacerbation. We shouldn't have a new era of indebtedness for developing countries for a problem in which they had a minority participation in creating. We shouldn't have to have a conversation on how we guarantee access to local communities and peoples when the requirements and conditions around climate rationality are improving, are getting more complicated as finance becomes available, even though science at the international level is getting better at understanding what it is that needs to be done and what the impacts are. But we still demand, even of local communities, that they do the same thing. We need to, again, articulate what's happening, how that has to do with climate change, what you want to do, what the climate impacts of your actions will be. So climate rationality, instead of being something useful, is becoming a barrier, particularly for at the community level. And finally, on the sub-goals, like Vice was telling you, I think we've had the experience in the finance group that saying loss and damage in the finance context has been has generated allergies in developed countries up until last year. Now, it's irrefutable that we need to have a conversation on loss and damage financing. We know that in the Transitional Committee, despite the efforts of the developing countries in the Transitional Committee, the tendency is not to speak about a fund, because as you know, the decision from last year was to establish a fund and funding arrangements, but to focus on funding arrangements and understand what funding arrangements are, what it is that currently exists, what needs to be done. And then once we understand the breadth and the scenario and the entirety of funding arrangements around the world, we can discuss a fund. And that's never going to happen. I mean, it's an argument that we tend to see every time in the finance discussions that throws us into technical expert dialogues, high-level ministerial meetings throughout years and years and years. And then, like the NCQG, we come to a year like last year, and we said, we've had 4 technical expert dialogues. Let's talk about what happened in those dialogues. And there's complete lack of interest to talk about what happened in the dialogues because we're not done with the process yet. If we harvest now, we might not be as ambitious as if we harvest at the end. So there's a conversation that needs to be had around loss and damage financing, that there needs to be push. We can talk about how we finance a fund from different sources, that's fine, but there needs to be one stable source with a replenishment process and with the capacity to respond in an appropriate time. The GCF is taking 5 years from the moment you get an idea until the moment you receive funding. I mean, governments change in that time. We have to see what happens with the LDF. There needs to be a very strong eye from everyone as to what happens in the COP, because the COP will adopt operating modalities for that fund. It needs to be practical. It needs to respond at speed. It needs to have predictable sources of funding. The Adaptation Fund has no predictable sources of funding, and I feel bad for the Adaptation Fund when it comes to a COP and it becomes a beggar, and it says, I'm out of funds, I need somebody to help me out. And since the headquarters is in Bonn, it's mostly Germany who responds to the Adaptation Fund, but nobody else does, and that's why the Adaptation Fund has no money. But I'll leave it at that. I feel I've tried to tell you everything in a couple of seconds, and sorry for ranting on, but thank you for the opportunity, Mina.
Thank you. Thank you, Andres. That was not a rant. I think it was very significant in the way that you have followed and how you highlighted a few things. I just wanted to add 2 other things that we are seeing in terms of financing and how it's moving forward. One is in the context of pushing what is attractive. One of the new agendas is actually more trade liberalization in the developing world. We open up your markets, we will bring in our technology, we will bring in our finance, and this is what we call the new colonialism. So this is the new kind of conditionalities that are happening. So they're saying, this is very significant in the JETP discussion, the Just Energy Transition Partnership. So if you look at the content, and let's pay attention to what is there. So what we are hearing is, yes, we are very happy to do the energy transition, and we are happy to help you with this and that, but it's our companies, and you have to take on the guarantees, and you have to ensure that the government pays back the loans and so on. So this is what we are hearing. And so I think we need to pay attention to that next stage of how we never, ever become really independent economically or socially. We are always locked into this inequity. And the other thing I wanted to also underscore what you're saying is in many of our developing countries, what we constantly see is that the only thing that our climate change divisions are doing is reporting. More and more reporting, more and more transparency, more and more this. So if you ask them, why aren't you doing other things like adaptation plans or implementing? Say, we have no time because all we have to do is do the reporting. So this is what's happening. And so you can draw up your NAPs, you can draw up your NDCs, but you don't have any money for implementation. So this is incredibly frustrating. And so I think we as particularly those of us from the Global South, we have to see what the writing is. And for those of you who constantly say we need to have targets, we need to have targets, when you see countries resisting targets, you know why. You know why that we cannot have a mitigation-centric, lopsided approach which does not link the implementation of targets with money, when you have to have a target on money and technology transfer. They don't like the word transfer. It's all about they sending in the technology in their companies and more intellectual property. And so it's just a new form of business. It's a new business. It's a green business that we are used for. So I think those of us who are here, why do we keep remaining here? Because we have to fight, and we'll keep fighting on this one. I'm sure there are a lot of questions. We have about 10 minutes. I'm sorry that we have such a limited time. We'll take the questions. Are there questions online as well, Hilary? Please alert me. So yes, please identify yourself and say where you want to whom you are asking this question. Introduce yourself first. Yes, please.
Yes. My name is Manel Bofo from the Universitat Politècnica de Catalunya from Barcelona, and I had a question directed to Mr. Vicente Paolo Yu III, but maybe other people might want to add on this. Vicente. And I wanted to ask specifically, shortly, do you see a window of opportunity to operationalize equity in the GST process this year? The context is, you said, and I think, and I can agree with you, that there has been a breakthrough last year in the loss and damage efforts from the G77, and I wanted to know if you think there may be a breakthrough in equity. Thank you.
We'll collect a few questions. Yes, Niti?
Yeah, hi, Niti from Climate Action Network, Southeast Asia. Also a question to Vice. You said a lot of participation from non-state actors in the technical dialogue. That included the fossil fuel industry. And what will G77 be doing to mitigate the negative and retrogressive inputs they have provided to the process to get an ambitious GST?
Any other? Yes, Adrian.
Hi, Adrien with Corporate Accountability. A question for Dr. Kanitkar. There's this wonderful research you have and a few other important papers outlining this similar issue. I wonder if you've already considered a more global sort of initiative to address this within these processes, or with these other experts or with these other academics.
Okay, now we'll let the responses come first. Vice and then Tejo.
Thank you for those questions. I'll be quite brief. one window of opportunity to operationalize equity in the global stocktake. The opportunity is always there. Whether or not we grab that opportunity is the question. And whether, and for me, the best way really to do that is do what has been proven to work, which is to get the G77 speaking as one on it. So far, we have been. I'm happy to say that. The details, to what extent we're able to get agreement on the details is something that we will be working on in the next hour or so, because I have to go to my coordination meeting. But we will definitely raise equity as an issue. My hope and expectation is that our colleagues on the other side will see this as important. Very slim hope, not much expectation, but at least it's not zero, right? So if it's not zero or not negative, at least if you double it, you will still get some gain. But maybe not to the extent of, getting all three out of the, three that Andres was pointing out earlier in terms of attractiveness, singleness, and not being crazy. On the technical dialogue and sort of like fossil fuel industry, sort of like inputs into it that Nitin was asking about. The technical dialogue process itself is shaped by the co-facilitators. Those of us who are negotiating as parties, there we can provide suggestions to the co-facilitators, but the way that we had that the operational modalities for the global stocktake was designed and negotiated was that it gives them a lot of leeway, and I guess for them it was let all voices be heard and let 1,000 flowers bloom kind of approach. How do we address it to mitigate the inputs? Of course, for the group, it has always been to say, several things. One is equity is important. Second is best available science. Third is always the linkage to whatever you try to put forward on mitigation and adaptation. Is always that linkage to the means of implementation. And we will be revolving around that. And usually it would then be up to individual groups within the G77 to sort of like provide more specificity in terms of how we approach that particular issue. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. There is one of the major barriers, again, Andres spoke about finance on so many aspects that becomes a major barrier for some of the modeling exercises, especially the global modeling exercises, for example. One major issue is the lack of resources in developing countries, even in where you have scientific capacity, perhaps. Just simply the degree of resources you need in terms of computational capacities, etc., becomes a barrier to doing this kind of work. And so it would be good if we have, we do have collaborations in terms of academic collaborations, but putting together alternative frameworks. You don't necessarily have to create one another integrated assessment model. I don't think we need another integrated assessment model, to be frank, but we need alternative frameworks. But to create these, we need to sort of build capacities within the Global South. And this is something, that there are so many aspects of capacity building that Substa, etc., look at. But this is a key one because it's a key input, as considered a key input across various aspects of the negotiations. And here we have absolutely no footprint. It was earlier in the Earth system modeling regime. Even there, the footprint of the Global South is lower than it should be. In the IIMs, it is even lower than the Earth system modeling. So there is definitely a major gap of capacities, and this is something that the negotiations should address. I'm not an expert there. Maybe Wise or Andres can speak about how this can be done. But how is it that we increase the participation of countries from the global south in this entire effort is something that we should talk about.
Sorry, yeah, I just wanted to follow up because I forgot to mention it. What Mina was saying earlier as well. Finance is a key part, right? It's an enabler. But equally the same, and I think this was pointed out by Tajal earlier, it's about technology as well. And technology, I think since maybe 2017 has sort of like almost died, at least in the process in terms of the conversation. We had our meeting yesterday on a global stock take within the G77, and colleagues who have been following the technology negotiations have been saying that when you read the periodic assessment of the Technology Executive Committee and all that, coming out from the technology side of the process, all of those assessments are essentially saying that technology transfer is not happening. And that's precisely because of what Mina was saying, that when you talk about technology from the developed country perspective, it's about trade. It's about where do they get the market, right? They say, okay, if you buy our stuff, that's already transferred technology. But if you read Article 4.5 of the Convention, there are two things in there that is quite important. One is what Andres was mentioning earlier. It's the obligation to promote, facilitate access to, including financing of technology transfer to developing countries. And second, it's not just the transfer of technology of the hardware, but it's also the transfer of know-how. And the second part of Article 4.5 also says that it should be about helping developing countries develop their own endogenous technology, right? So think about this. Article 4.5 has been there since 1992. 1994 entered into force. If you look at who owns the technology, 80% of patented climate-related technologies are owned by countries in the global north. 80%. You look it up. There's a UNEP study, there's an UNCTAD study, and there are OECD and World Bank studies that say that. In terms of global trade of climate-related technologies, including energy technologies that they all say we need to have because of renewable energy, etc., 2/3 of that trade are with goods which are produced in developed countries, traded among developed countries, and innovated on in developed countries. 2/3. Which means that if you talk about technology transfer as an enabler, it is not happening. And one last thing, developing countries since 2001 up to the present have produced already something like more than 90 developed countries have produced something like 450 technology needs assessments reports. They have put together almost 1,000 or more than 1,000 what they call technology action plans. These are actually plans which they have put forward in the UNFCCC. They say these are the technologies that we need to have for us to do better on mitigation and adaptation. Guess how many of those plans have been funded and responded to by developed countries?
None.
Almost none. Right? So think about it. Thank you.
I'm sorry to say that the people online, I know you have questions for Mr. Mogro. We are not able to answer them. We have a tight, strict procedure here. You have to end on time. So I really apologize for that. Thank you so much to the speakers. I think, I hope that this has been a useful space. We heard a lot of frustration, but this is a frustration that is important to be heard, not just in the halls here, but outside as well, so that we really get a fair, just, and at the end of the day, it's not all about targets which are locking in inequities further. So even in the fossil fuel debate, I think it's not about just phasing out fossil fuels, it's how do you do that in a way that is equitable, in a way that is just, and there is money on the table to, when you say keep the oil in the ground, we always say, where is the money to keep oil in the ground? So we do need to say that, and if we don't say that, you are locking in energy poverty forever. So I think, and sorry?
And
energy poor.
Poverty.
Energy poverty, that's what I said. So I do think that the voices, the points that we are amplifying: equity, equity, climate justice, equity, and money and technology and capacity building. The whole works, not just mitigation. Thank you very much.
I just want to take the opportunity that the room is full to invite you. We have a side event beginning in 15 minutes in Meeting Room Berlin on gender responsive climate finance. So if you want to be there, you're all more than welcome.
An announcement. We have a poster on some of this work on the IPCC scenarios in the technical dialogue of the GST. So if you're interested, it's on the 7th.